One of the first things that I'd like to share with you is that I'm a generational artist. My great grandmother was an artist. She worked with uh, clothing as a seamstress. Then my grandmother was, I consider her a folk artist because she not only did quilting, but she made a lot of things. Now, when I was younger, it was the fashion amongst women of my grandmother's generation to make like toilet tissue covers or crocheted cozies for a teapot. But my grandmother, she had what I call an artistic lifestyle because she created beautiful things for her home. She created beautiful things to give to her family. But when she went through the process of migrating from Georgia to the north, for like an economic migration kind of thing. She moved to Chicago first.
Where was she from in Georgia?
She's from Macon, Georgia.
And was her mother from Macon
and
too?
her mother was from Macon.
Okay.
Okay. And she moved to Chicago and she got a job in a factory that made Donald Ducks. She was so excited every morning to get up and go to work there. And I felt that she really loved it because it gave her an artistic outlet for her creativity.
She was making.
She was making.
Yeah.
And so she loved that job. And so she was, I guess, my inspiration for the type of life that I'm living now. Her name was Hattie Battle Miles. Okay, my grandmother, Hattie, was a quilter and I say a folk artist because she made all kind of stuff. You know, in that period of time, you know, where you had people making flower pots out of old tires and stuff like that. That's kind of the thing my grandmother, you know,
did lots of different things.
Kind of into like yard art.
And she was the one that migrated to Chicago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she migrated to Chicago and with my mother, she was a single mother. My grandmother was a single mother at that time. And then she brought my mother she came back to Georgia. And then my mother stayed with her mother while my grandmother went to New York to Queens, New York. And she was a domestic engineer. And but all through that time, you know, she maintained that love for creativity. And then when she moved back to Georgia in the 70s, we became not only, you know, we were relatives, but we became fast friends because we had so much in common. And once she came back to the South, it helped my family to know me better because I was a lot like her. You know, she was not reclusive, but she enjoyed her own company. And I'm kind of like that, okay? And she loved all things creative. She loved all things colorful. And her favorite colors were red and green. Yeah, so I kind of picked up that energy. Now, I would talk with my grandmother, Gina, and she would tell me things about New York. But, you know, coming from the South, she had her own dialect. Because my grandmother used to tell me all the time, Madam X school was across the street from where I lived. And I would go there and I would buy papers from the Black Muslims. Madam X, I come to find, was Malcolm X. I found that my grandmother supported the free breakfast program with the Black Panther. Grandmother was hanging out with the Panthers. And, you know, that was so intriguing to me in the 60s. Here's my grandmother. And, you know, they had a Panther party headquarters on what used to be Ashby Street. And I was so intrigued with them. You know, I saw them as, you know, renegades and tough, wily kind of guys. Okay, but my grandmother had alliances with, you know, people that were trying to promote and grow and develop the Black community. I found that really inspiring. So I would spend a lot of time with her telling me stories while she quilted and while I helped. Now, Gina, initially, you know, like my mother didn't quilt. My mother did. She helped me with one quilt that we have that my sister had did the top, and me and my other sister and my mom, we quilted it after my sister had passed. But my mother wasn't really into quilting, Gina. And this is really, I find this an interesting cultural phenomenon. My mother moved from Macon, Georgia to Atlanta, Georgia. And my mother considered herself a hipster. And she was cool. And she was into current things, right? Not quilted. She wanted her a blanket. No, she wanted her one of them duvet sets from Sears and Roebuck. You know,
Yeah.
It wasn't until my grandmother came back to Atlanta and did her work, and really it wasn't until the G-spin quilt that my family appreciated my grandmother. They thought my grandmother was eccentric and a little crazy. Okay. And I was the one who really clung to her and wanted to hear her stories.
Yeah.
They were bored, you know, they couldn't see that. But I saw that. And then working at the High doing the G's Event exhibit and seeing my grandmother's work reflected in those quilts, you know, it just really increased my desire to want to carry forward my family's legacy. My mother, she might not have been a quilter, but she appreciated beautiful things. And she appreciated money. My whole family began to see. So whereas they might have had quilts in the garage, quilts under the mattress, they took those things out and they saw them in a whole new light.
Yeah.
And what really did it was when the Clark Atlanta, you know, the Trevor Arnett Gallery, they bought 6 of my grandmother's quilts. And I was so happy that had happened before she passed.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that motivated me, Gina, is my grandmother said that one of her fondest dreams would have been that someone would have looked at her artwork, appreciated it, and gave her some money for it. Because our family and people in the community would come and see the beautiful things she did. And they said, oh, give me that. But she wanted someone to actually buy it. Before she died, I had a friend named Ascari that kind of collected and bought craft stuff and resold it. And so he and my grandmother developed a fast friendship. And he would come over like Friday or Saturday, and he'd buy a couple of quilts from my grandmother. And I just saw something different happening in her, appreciating it and then laying down the cash.
Yeah.
So she was able to then have money to buy bedding, nice fabric. Because at first my grandmother was putting blankets in her quilts. From my uncle, he had been in the army.
Yeah.
And you know, they had these army blankets kind of olive green. She was using those first. But then when she started getting a little extra cash,
Yeah.
she was able to buy some stuff.
Yeah.
Now, my grandmother, to me, was a primary source of history around quilting.
Yeah.
Because my grandmother never saw a quilting book or magazine until she was 85. And that's when I showed it to her.
Now she learned that from her mother.
She
Susie?
learned it from her mother, but
Yeah.
she also learned it from women in the community. Because it was a community endeavor. People had quilting bees, you know, to make these quilts. It was necessity quilting. You'll see with all of the quilters of that time, it wasn't just about utility. It was also about beauty and then just enhancing the life experience for their family. You know, and so that was the kind of tradition that my grandmother, you know, was in with her quilting, because even though she quilted before she went on her migration, when she came back to Atlanta, she hooked up with her old quilting friends. So they would get together and quilt, exchange fabric and stuff, you know, so she carried that on and she quilted until 3 weeks before her last breath. You could just see in my grandmother's work during her last year, she died from colon cancer. And she was in a lot of pain.
Yeah.
That's a painful way to die.
Yeah.
Okay? But she still wanted to quilt. And so her stitches went like this, Dina. But she still was, you know, living her life as an artist, a maker.
Yeah.
And so when she passed, my sister and I said, we're going to carry on our family's legacy of creativity. Okay, I have one sister that has passed. Her name was Helen. And Helen loved being a maker. Before she really got really down into that quilting, she was a techno person in the family with computers and stuff like that. But when my grandmother transitioned, we all said that we were going to carry that on. So she and I, it created another layer of love between me and my big sister, you know, because we had a common pastime.
Yeah.
And it was so sweet, Gina. You know, I was working, doing presentations for guilds and stuff like that. And so she would be my bride. And so what would happen would be I would pay her for doing it. And then I'd take her to lunch. And then we would have money. So we'd go to like Joann's, and we'd be able to buy supplies that we could use in our work. So I have some of my sister's quilts that I got machine quilted, and I have her blocks and some of her tops. Okay, now my sister wasn't really a quilter. Like for me, I like to make the top, I like to make the sandwich, I like to quilt it. My sister was mathematically minded. She just liked to make the blocks. The intricate different blocks that might take 20 pieces to make, that was what she liked
to do. Yeah.
Okay, so I inherited all of that. And so for me, part of my hope for myself as a maker, as a heritage worker, working on a traditional Georgia craft, my hope is to take my sister's blocks and create quilts with them. I have my deceased son's artwork, and I have my grandmother's stuff. I mean, that's a package. That's a story waiting to be told. You know, so what I'm trying to do with my work, Gina, is, you know, I just try to do everything I can to try to get more print material, you know, articles and things like that, or videos, more things, so that I'm developing that kind of energy that would, where they would welcome me, bringing in the other things that my family has done. I am a generational quilter, okay? And like I told you, my mother kind of skipped over a generation with my mother, but my grandmother and my great-grandmother were quilters too. So what I brought, Gina, was some things that I wanted to show you how I'm striving as an artist to make a connection between African textiles and what I do. What made me go on this quest, Gina, was this. I'd like to show you something. On this quilt right here, you could see the binding and how that's folded over. When you look at these textiles from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Kuba people, you'll see that the way that they did their binding is the same way that my grandmother taught me.
Yeah.
This is folded over, you know, and in those units. And so I also brought this to show you because I had started on a work of art, and you know, hand quilting takes a while. So, you know, I got plenty of projects in bags that I'm working on. This was actually inspired by these Kuba pieces, and what I had done was, you know, took the same kind of coloration that they used, and I created these units, and they're gonna be sewn together using a stitch just like they used to put these together. And so I'm working on developing a whole series of quilts and things that I've made in which I'm just directly taking inspiration from African textiles and incorporating that into my work. Now this piece that I brought sort of lends itself to the idea that a lot of African textile artists created things, whether they were woven and pieced, put them together in panel. Okay, so they would call this strip piecing.
So in a sense, like, you know, often we think of quilts as squares, patched, you know, sewn together. But the Kuba material, because of the way the material's woven, it's almost like rectangular panels.
And one of the other things that I'm trying to do with my work, Gina, is I'm trying to take processes and techniques that African artists use and try to gain some kind of understanding of how they're done, and as a preserver of this these ideas and these ways of doing things. Like with this particular quilt, you'll see in different African textiles, might do what you call reverse applique. You'll cut out a hole and maybe patch it. It might not have just been something beautiful. This could have been a way to patch clothes. Okay.
So instead of the patch being on top,
the patch is
underneath.
And so another thing I did, as I had said, this whole idea of the strips, you know, I did this. And this technique right here that I did these, this is what you call foundation paper piecing. So each one of these little strips was sewn onto a piece of freezer paper. And then I would sew another one to that, flip it over, iron it down. Sew another one to it, flip it over, and just go through that whole process. And that was something my grandmother loved to do.
Do you use a sewing machine at all? And when you do, for what part? What aspect?
I use a sewing machine to put together the top. When I first started quilting, Gina, I was doing everything by hand.
Yeah.
And then VSA offered me a one-woman show. I had to look at what I was doing, and it just dawned on me. There's no way I could make enough work to be in a gallery doing everything by hand. So I started doing the piecing on the sewing machine. Then also, I taught myself how to machine quilt. Now, Gina, you know I'm paralyzed from my chest down, so I can't use a foot pedal.
Yeah.
Okay? And the first sewing machine I had a foot pedal. So what I would do would be that, imagine this is my sewing machine. I would have my foot pedal right here, and I'd be mashing my foot pedal with
And
this
then
hand,
sewing with the one hand?
And I sew with one hand.
Yeah, yeah.
And I taught myself how to machine quilt like
Yeah.
that, Gina. Like,
And that's hard. I have a hard time. Yeah.
and so another thing that I brought that I wanted to show you, Gina, was a quilt that I did for exhibit at Agnes Scott. Agnes Scott did an exhibit last year during coronavirus in September called Coming Home. And so what they wanted artists to do was be inspired by that whole idea of home. And so, you know, I could have whipped out that housetop quilt pattern, but what I wanted to do was do something that related to textiles, but also the idea of home. So what I did was I got a lot of African art books and stuff. So what I did was house quilt pattern, and I made this pattern myself. This house quilt, but each one of the windows and doors have designs that I took from African textiles. Block printed the doors and windows, and this is a rubbing technique with Shiba paint pens with oil. It's like people that paint in oil paints. I called it Finding My Way Back Home. Okay, and the whole idea of it was, Gina, is me rediscovering African textiles and then reimagining them in different kind of ways and preserving them. Because a lot of the makers in Africa are experiencing displacement or are experiencing having to do climate migration and all kind of things like that. Now I know that universities traditionally send students to Africa, you know, so we studying weaving, we're doing this and that. But I wanted to, just as an artist, I wanted to find my way back home. So what I started doing was beautiful books like this, I'm collecting them and trying to incorporate a lot of this design into my artwork. I learned how to dye from an African woman, neighborhood art center. Okay, and I worked there teaching embroidery, and this African woman was there teaching tie-dye. And so she couldn't really sew garments like I could. She had all this fabric. So I was making garments, and we kind of bartered. She teaching me how to do what she did. So I learned originally using fiber reactive Procyon dye. However, when I got in a wheelchair, I couldn't do immersion dyeing anymore. So the cold water dyeing I started doing as direct application. Direct, like putting it in squeezed bottle. Going through the same tying process, but directly applying the dye to the fabric. So I would use soda ash as the mordant to make the dye go in the fabric. So I would tie the bundles, soak them in soda ash, squeeze them out, and then directly apply the dye and put it in a Ziploc bag. Let it live maybe 24 hours, then I could rinse it. Because in 24 hours, the soda ash would have caused the chemical reaction to happen. You know, but when I got in a wheelchair, I had to do something different. I'm paralyzed from my chest down, so I couldn't really like go over in buckets without falling over. So a friend of mine introduced me to this product, airbrush colors for fabric. Createx makes it, Jacquard makes it, several companies make it because it's a product that people use to do airbrushing on t-shirts. So, you know, he had bought some art supplies, and it was a few bottles of that in there. And I read somewhere that you could do a faux tie-dyeing process with it. And so I started experimenting. First, man, my
Yeah.
stuff wasn't coming out like nothing. Because with the dye I use, you have to really, well, it's not a dye, it's actually a pigment. You have to work it in the folds. But I didn't know, you have to
Yeah.
learn. And I was ready to give that stuff up, man. My grandmother, I could see her now walking down the street with her little stick. But she had a stick because it was dog. My grandmother would bring me $10 and buy a bag of scraps for me. And she would tell me, baby, don't give up. Keep doing it. You'll get it. You'll
Yeah,
get it.
yeah.
And so I got it. Then my grandmother told me, Marquetta, you shouldn't just be selling your fabric to Faith Ringgold. You need to be making some quilts with your own fabric. So that's when I kind of started getting the idea of not just doing textiles to sell to other makers, actually do
Make 'em
something
yourself.
with my
Yeah.
textiles.
So amazing is it's your quilting.
Mhm.
But it's not just your quilting. It's that you're dyeing and creating these fabrics and you're printing. And so it's just like in so many levels that, your hand is involved.
Departing from traditional ways
Yeah.
and a bit in that. Imagine this, traditional setting. First of all, you had the weaver that wove the fabric right, and then
Yeah.
you got the tyer that ties it, then you have the dyer that dyes it, and then you have the tailor that sells the fabric and creates garments for people.
Right, right.
Whereas for me, I'm trying to do all of those processes myself. So it's bigger. It's not better, but it's different.
It's different. It's,
It's just different. But I'm still
your
trying.
relationship with the material
Mhm.
is so much different. And I guess that's what I'm thinking about than just going to Cloth World and buying a
Yeah.
pretty blue. You made that blue.
Yeah.
You
Now-
know that blue.
now
That blue,
one of the-
yeah, I mean, that blue comes from you versus just, I picked this out at Cloth World.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because this particular piece is hand dyed, it's hand printed, it's hand rubbed, and it's hand quilted.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's something that I feel good about, because not only am I still connected to things that my family did as makers, but I'm also preserving culture, and I'm bringing sewing and quilting to a whole new generation.
Yeah.
You know.